Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach who works to help individuals, organizations, and communities realize their fullest potential. You can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. On today's broadcast, we're live discussing the latest scholarship on college men and masculinities. This episode of Student Affairs Live is part of the HigherEdLive network. All of our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Participate in today's discussion by tweeting us at HigherEdLive. We'll be monitoring the back channel and engaging with you there and bringing those conversations into today's discussion. We broadcast Student Affairs Live approximately twice each month on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern. Today's live broadcast is powered by Platform Q, Education's conduit online engagement platform. Learn how to integrate continuous online engagement into your marketing enrollment plans using Conduit. Visit platformqedu.com. All of our episodes are recorded. They're free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com. You can take HigherEdLive with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. HigherEdLive is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. For most of us, there are few decisions in life more complex, expensive, or impactful than the college choice. As marketing and enrollment professionals, we must understand the factors that drive this important choice, as well as thoughts and emotions our target audiences experience, in order to develop empathy for the groups that we serve. Would you like a tool to help navigate these challenges? Enter the Experience Map. Join M. Stoner on Tuesday, August 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Pacific for their free webinar, A Mile in Their Shoes, Building Empathy Through Experience Mapping. You'll learn the benefits of an experience map and discover how it can impact your enrollment and marketing strategy. We'll be tweeting out a link with registration information on that shortly. But now, on to today's show. Today, we're talking about Men and Masculinities with the co-editors of a new book integrating theory and practice. I'd like to welcome them, and let's begin with a little bit of, tell us a little bit about who you are, your pronouns, and let's begin with Brian.
Yeah. Keith, thank you for having us today. I'm Brian McGowan. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I actually just transitioned to a new role, so you don't see anything on my walls. I just moved to Washington, D.C. I'm in my apartment. I will be an associate professor of education at American University, where I will serve as the associate director for the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning. I work professionally primarily in residence life and housing. I've also worked at a higher education research center. And I've been engaged in this work for over a decade now, with my scholarship on Black college men illuminating their realities across different campuses through professional associations, primarily through ACPA, Coalition on Men and Masculinities, shout out to the group, where I served as a scholar in residence for a while and also served on their faculty for the Emerging Scholars Workshop. It's actually where I met Dan and Keith through that work. And I've worked with different men's groups, faculty and staff, on various campuses, exploring many of the issues that we explore in the book. And so, welcome.
Thanks, Brian. And you make a great reminder. We should really thank the ACPA's Coalition for Men and Masculinities for many things, and I'm sure we get a chance to mention that, but they're also helping us share the word and get this out. They wanted to have a conversation about the book, and why do it twice? Let's just do this once and really engage lots of folks. So thanks for introducing yourself, Brian. Dan, over to you. Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Thanks, Keith. Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Tillapaugh. He, him, his pronouns. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Counselor Education at California Lutheran University. A little bit in terms of my background. I served for 4 years as the chair of the Coalition on Men and Masculinities through ACPA. Had the great honor of sort of overseeing the work of a lot of terrific professionals interested in men's development, and so a lot of that experience has sort of led into why this book came about, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, over our time together. My research is really looking at intersectionality in higher education, and particularly often looking at that through the lens of gender and sexuality, race, and other forms of identity around the student experience, and particularly student development. And so my work has largely been focused on queer sexual minority men in college and their experience experiences and how they make meaning of their multiple identities. And connected to that, a lot of college men work and masculinity is a strong interest of mine. So I'm really glad to be here. Looking forward to the next bit of time to talk more about our book.
Mm-hmm. Well, awesome. I'm really glad to have you here. So this is the book that we're talking about, Men and Masculinities, Theoretical Foundations and Promising Practices for Supporting College Men's Development. It is out. You can buy it now. We'll share a link at the end of this with a little discount code if you want to buy it directly from Silas. Full disclosure, I am a contributing author to one of the chapters. I was very honored to be invited to do that and to author some of that. So mostly that's just fair warning. We're going to totally nerd out today and dive into this. So if you're into that, here we go. So the book begins with a foreword from Ryan Barone, who's been thinking critically about men and masculinities for a long time. And he begins with a quote from Bell Hooks, which is, learning to wear a mask, that word already embedded in the term masculinity, is the first lesson in patriarchal masculinity that a boy learns. He learns that his core feelings cannot be expressed if they do not conform to the acceptable behaviors sexism defines as male. Asked to give up the true self in order to realize the patriarchal ideal, boys learn self-betrayal early and are rewarded for these acts of soul murder. And then right away, Ryan gets in with how he's been complicit in doing that throughout his life and what he's learning and how he's unlearning. I just love that as a place to start. So Dan, maybe you can begin, just for folks who are less familiar, why are we talking about masculinities plural? And why are we differentiating between men and male, and why is that so important?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think for me, why I am sort of choosing to use masculinities plural is to recognize the fact that there is a whole spectrum of masculinities that exist, and a lot of scholarship that actually is talking about masculinities in very nuanced ways, right? So a lot of times I think there's an assumption by a lot of folks that masculinity is really owned by men, and actually, in fact, that's not true, right? There are female masculinities and great work on that from Jack Halberstam and others. There is hegemonic masculinity, which oftentimes gets conflated as toxic masculinity, and the ways in which masculinity can be unhealthy. It can serve as that soul murder, like Bell Hooks is talking about, the ways in which young boys and men throughout their life are told that you can't actually express emotions. You should not express any weakness. You shouldn't look weak. You have to be competitive. And then I also think that there are I have critical hope that we can move to places where we can have healthier masculinities, and really to understand from a pro-feminist sort of viewpoint around moving to more gender equity of how masculinity can serve as a very powerful tool too, and how, again, how can we be chivalrous and at the same time not be sexist? How can we work to sort of undo that learning of sort of the negative ways? And again, if people like beer, that's great. If people like sports, that's great. But how can we also recognize that there are costs and consequences of sort of buying into a particular type of masculinity that I sometimes think can be really unhealthy? So I think that's why we use masculinities. In terms of the piece about male versus men, in conversations with Brian, we really wanted to sort of approach and ask our contributing authors to think critically about these two terms. And so I think historically there's been a lot of folks who use these terms as synonyms, that male and men are the one and the same. And in fact, really they're talking about different pieces. So male is really a sex term. Men is a gender term. And when we use male, I believe, and I'll just speak for myself, that I think sometimes we then render individuals invisible or push folks to the margin if we're only using terminology of male, because not every single person who identifies as a man identifies as male. And so I think we have to be thoughtful about, are we talking about gender or are we talking about sex? And how can we be explicit in the use of our language to help actually be more more inclusive potentially, and to also broaden out. When I think about my colleagues, TJ Jorian and Chase Catalano, who talk a lot about trans men or transmasculine men and their experience, ultimately, if we use male, that's not necessarily going to connect to some of our transmasculine men students who are on our campuses. And so how are we then using language that could potentially close doors or close off opportunities, and limit who we're serving? And so again, that's part of why we're really trying to help folks grapple with these different terms and how we use them in our work.
Dan, that's awesome. You just kind of gave a great primer on men and masculinities and language, and that's really great. This is a great volume, continues on a lot of really good scholarship that other folks have been doing for a long time, and really builds on that and offers new thinking and new practice. And I love the combination of new theoretical concepts that had my brain popping and thinking about things in a new way, and also very practical, concrete suggestions, examples. How did this project get started?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So Dan received ACPA's Inuit Correctus Honors, and I was there with him. And we were leaving the reception. He said, "Brian, I want to talk with you about something." And we were literally in the hallway. Dan, I don't know if you remember this, but we were in the hallway. He said, "Hey, I have this idea that I've been brewing for a long time, and I invite you to co-author this book with me." And so Dan and I had several phone calls thinking about what topics should we foreground. We even went to folks who do this work in ACPA and NASPA and really invited and solicited ideas. Hey, we're doing this book. What should we write about? What types of topics should we explore? And we were very intentional about who we wanted to write each of the chapters. And we wanted to pair student affairs professionals and practitioners with faculty members to co-write chapters. A lot of times, folks in practice don't have a lot of opportunities to publish, right? And so it was very important for us to create publication outlets, but also we really wanted to foreground this book around practice. And I think that's the main point. So when you look at the book, the first two chapters are around theory and the evolution of the work and how the work on Men and Masculinities has evolved. But also, we really wanted to hit those contents, thinking about like assessment and evaluation, thinking about retreat programs, thinking about coalition building. Like we wanted what is actually happening on the grounds, like a how-to book. And so another thing I'll just add for me in particular, when I got engaged in this work, just wanted to push back against this literature base a bit. When I was reading as a doctoral student and being engaged, a lot of the work was written by white men on white men, right? And wanted to push back against that. And so folks such as like T. Elon Dancy and Sean Harper, Cameron Beatty, Keon McGuire, Chris Salinas, folks who are actually conducting studies on non-white populations, Black and brown men, and really contributing and nuancing the literature. And so that was something that's been important to me. And that's something that the readers will find in this text as well.
Yeah, I think if I can just jump in, one of the things that I think Brian and I were really wanting is exactly that, right? Taking a look at masculinities from an intersectional viewpoint and really sort of broadening out the conversation. One of the things, this book, for me, I started thinking about it way back in 2012. I had some conversations with Jason Laker and a couple other wonderful colleagues who had me sort of like continue to think about what is our need? When I read Frank Harris and Sean Harper's College Men text, when I read Jason Laker and Tracy Davis's Masculinities in Higher Ed texts, those were amazing, so helpful to sort of my thinking and the work. And it really had me percolate. But at the same time, I was sort of left with, okay, so for me, that piece about practice becomes so important, like Brian was saying. When we go to the Conference on College Men, which had happened regularly for every other year for a number of years, constantly folks are sharing their good work of how they're working to support college men on college campuses. And yet I recognize that there were a lot of folks who couldn't afford to go to that conference necessarily. They didn't have the professional development funds or whatnot. And so folks were sending messages on Facebook in the Coalition on Men and Masculinities group, or in NASPA's MMKC, Men and Masculinities Knowledge Community group, asking, hey, does anybody do something like this? Or does somebody have any recommendations for implementing a retreat for men? And I just really felt like this would serve, this book would serve as an opportunity to help folks pick up, find a chapter, find something that could really help them start this work in earnest, and give them, you know, ideas to sort of generate where they wanted to go. And so I'm super excited and very proud of sort of what Brian and I were able to sort of do, along with our brilliant chapter contributors, in terms of forwarding some really, really great ideas that, again, are really theoretical into practice, and vice versa. So I think it's a very helpful text.
Yeah, and I think that's clear to the reader of the book, is that there is building on the previous scholarship, really looking at bringing gender expansive practice, pushing on heteronormative definitions, bringing in cultural masculinities and all of that. So that's a really great contribution theoretically and conceptually. But then these very tangible, here's an activity you can do, or here's an activity that's been done, here's how you could trouble it, here's how you move it in this direction, in this direction, in this direction. A lot of great resources. And as you mentioned, I find that I am often asked, what's a campus that's doing a great job on this? And what's a campus doing? And I have a hard time, because I know a lot of these. But then I'm like, well, I recommend this. Well, that person who ran that left, and that doesn't even happen anymore. So it's, right. I feel like the good examples are often moving with good practitioners who take them with them, and it's hard to kind of cook that down. So I love that you've kind of captured a lot of good thinking here, and good examples that people can find out more about, but also some of the formula. Here's 7 steps. Here's some things to consider that I think can be not universal, but can help guide people's thinking as they move into some of this. Who did you imagine is kind of the ideal reader of this, and what do you hope they'll be able to really do with this?
Yeah. So I'll jump in here, and Brian can add in more. I think, to me, I was thinking about the general student affairs practitioner who is looking to start something, right? And maybe not sure where to get started. You know, I think the thing that I kept thinking about repeatedly as we were sort of scaffolding out our outline of which chapters go where, was thinking about, well, like, this book could be read linearly, or it could just be somebody is like trying to think about how do they build a campus coalition? Well, they can turn to chapter 4 and start there, and then go back through the book somewhere else. I do think, you know, that general practitioner working in student affairs, that's our main audience. But certainly, I think that there's a lot of relevant pieces too of thinking about undergrads who are part of, you know, men of color communities, men's groups on campus, peer advisors, doing men's work for other men. Like, I think there's also utility in terms of that, grad students as well. I think faculty can take away some key pieces here. And to be honest, like, an interesting piece, because I'm starting to sort of get some questions from parents, right? So like parents who are really wanting to sort of understand, like, how can they help the young men in their lives, in their families, and trying to figure out, like, how to best support them as they journey through life and navigate sometimes some very difficult situations around their gender identity, or thinking about masculinities in the large view. So those I think are some of the people that I'm thinking about in terms of a general audience of who really might be able to sort of use this book in critical ways.
Yeah, and I would add to that, thinking about the beginning chapters, right, for the practitioner who's looking to design, right? And so, again, you can look at each of the chapters or zero in on a particular chapter. But I also think about those initial 2 chapters, right? For folks who have higher ed and student affairs backgrounds who are doing the work, you take college student development courses, right? And we have discussions.
Brian, why don't you remind us what those first 2 chapters are, and give us a little context? I know we've got the table of content here in the presentation, but just
Absolutely. So chapter 1, titled Theoretical Complexities of College Men and Masculinity. So Dan Dan Chase and Tracy wrote that chapter, really talking about the work itself, right? Think of different theories, what theories have typically guided the work and where the work is going, but also considerations for student development. I think this is a piece where asking different questions like what has happened, what are we doing now, and where is the work going? And I think that's important, particularly if you haven't had a student development theory course in a long time. I think reading those foundational chapters could really get you up to speed about things that you should think about as you're designing your program. So it's meant to be hey, here are 2 quick chapters so you can get caught up to where we are in our thinking, and then hey, dive right in. So I think the general audience for the practitioner, but also for faculty as well, to piggyback on what Dan stated.
Yeah, I found a lot of what was shared in the theoretical aspects, both at the very beginning and the end of the book, to be really, really helpful reminders and guidance and pulling things together that have often been in lots of different other places, right? Yeah. Kind of brought together. So I love the sort of putting all of this in one place. Really helpful. Dan, maybe you can kind of walk us through, the book is organized into 3 parts. Mm-hmm. And the chapters kind of give us an overview of what's there. And then we'll have you pick your favorites.
We love them all. We love them all.
Exactly. Right. I love all my kids the same. That's right.
Exactly. I do indeed. So I do want to sort of say, like, one of the things that really inspired, I think, the organization of this book was, back around the time that I started in 2012 to think about it, the second edition of the Handbook for Student Leadership Programs came out. And so Susan Komovez, John Dugan, Julie Owen, Craig Slack, and Wendy Wagner had sort of released that. And again, as somebody who does a lot of leadership sort of research and work, I was really, that was a very helpful frame of sort of thinking about the theoretical pieces, sort of the pieces about design, program design, and then sort of different delivery methods. And so that was very much an inspiration to me in terms of thinking about how would I want to sort of create an organized sort of text on masculinities that would sort of move us through sort of that process of moving from theory and then operationalizing it, putting it into practice. And so that's really how we came up with this format. Part 1 is very much about the theoretical foundations of college men and masculinities. Part 2 is really about program design, and thinking about some larger pieces that then have to be threaded through all of the pieces that are discussed in Part 3, which is really about sort of specific program content and delivery. So in that section, thinking about, how to build men's retreats and those types of programs, what would it look like to sort of think about dialogue-based praxis programs and integrating that within men and masculinity spaces, talking about peer education and mentoring programs that exist, and then also thinking about how do we fold this into academic curriculum and create coursework that might be either for credit or not for credit around men and masculinities. And then lastly, thinking about those 4-year comprehensive programs that are offered for men, and thinking about what are the different pieces that we need to think about conceptually when we're crafting those types of programs and implementing those types of programs. So that's really sort of how the organization came to be and where that model is. So, for all of my colleagues back at the National Clearinghouse for Leadership Programs, a big debt is owed in terms of that. So, yeah.
It's just another great reminder that scholarship is cumulative and it builds on it, right? Both in the scholarship of men and masculinities, but you're also building on scholarship from the leadership realm and saying, well, that's an interesting model. How do we bring this to this? So thanks to other folks, and we'll see what this leads to, right? Who's going to build on this work?
Please build on it. Please build on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we won't have you pick your favorite, but Brian, I'd love to hear from you. A couple of chapters that just had your head bursting and your own aha moments, and you just thought, oh, this is really opening up my thinking in new ways.
Yeah. So again, a plug for each of the 11 chapters, but the one that I tend to go to the most, and it's the final chapter in the book, written by Z. Nicolazzo, titled "Contemporary Issues for College Men and Masculinities." She really encourages us to rethink the work, right? And so, even talking about how she comes to the work, her tensions with the work, who's included, who's excluded in the work, but also leading us with 8 considerations as you think about gender-based educational practice. And so again, get the book for all 8, but I'll tease out 2 or 3 of them because I think it's important as we think about where the work is going next. But she talks about knowing your epistemological leanings. Like, how do you even know what you know? How do you come to this work? How have you learned these things? There's an unlearning that needs to happen, right? For many of us, but how do you even come to know what you know? She encourages us to take a break from higher ed texts. So even moving beyond higher ed. And so just anyone who knows me, I love higher ed. I'm very critical of what we do in higher ed. And I think a lot of times we don't leave our own discipline. We are a newer field. We're taking concepts from other places and inviting conversations. But there are other disciplines who have way more expansive conceptualizations of gender. And so just even thinking beyond the authors that we cited, but even going outside, and she talks about embracing this trickle-up approach to educational practice that I really appreciate. And that involves guiding your practice for those who are on the margins, who are most vulnerable. And if you do that, everyone benefits. And so, again, these are some of the things that she's pushing us to think about in that final chapter. And I think it was a beautiful way to end the text. So that's one that really stands out for me, for sure.
Yeah, I would just echo to that. I think the thing that I love most about Z's chapter is it serves as almost a bookend to chapter 1 of the text, because it does echo back to the pieces that I think, when sitting down and talking with Tracy Davis and Chase Catalano and sort of framing out chapter 1 of like these theoretical foundations, we really wanted to, this is one of the chapters that I think will push, hopefully, folks to think about. As researchers, we're often asked to sort of identify what our epistemological frame is and how we sort of engage in the lenses of how we're viewing our work. And yet scholars or practitioners rather, operate from a lens too, but that doesn't always that's always not on the front of our consciousness. And so one of the things that I think is really important for us in chapter 1 was sort of highlighting how can practitioners be more thoughtful and more directly sort of explicit about what epistemological stance you're taking. Are you a critical practitioner? Are you a positivist? Are you somebody who's more of a constructivist? And how does that play out? And using the gender box activity, which often is sort of like a Men and Masculinity 101 activity that we often will use, talking about how that can sort of be used by practitioners using a specific epistemological or theoretical lens was, I think, something that I was really excited to sort of incorporate and to be able to sort of have my colleagues help me think through and problematize, because again, I think sometimes that activity can be very elementary and not really push folks, and also continue to sort of have some marginalization and exclusion. But if we sort of take it from a critical lens, how could that even look different? And so I think my hope is that folks will walk away feeling like their brain has been stretched a little bit by that chapter and that they have some new insights. The other chapter that I would just point to as well that I really love is chapter 4. And so Kyle Ashley and Rachel Wagner have a really lovely chapter about forwarding this new intersectional model of college men and masculinities programming. And so they've spent a good amount of time thinking about the different types of college men programming that exists, and really sort of lumping them into 3 different categories. One that's usually the largest, and that's talking about gender socialization. Another that's really about success programs and helping men persist and be retained and tapping into resilience. And then the last is really about violence prevention programs, and that could be peer education, bystander intervention programming. But they really looked at all of these different types of programs and the ways in which we're currently trying to serve students, and then used the intersectional model of multiple dimensions of identity as a lens to sort of forward new ideas and problematize the ways in which we could actually be much more thoughtful and move the needle on helping college men understand how systems of power, privilege, and oppression play out in their lives, and how that then has a consequence and also a reaction to how they're then going to sort of engage with others and in their communities. And so the work that they do in this chapter is just really incredible. It forwards a lot of great suggestions and very practical oriented concepts to sort of move the work forward in a way that I think is really speaking to equity and inclusivity and justice and liberation. So to me, I think that's another chapter that I would really encourage folks to take a look at strongly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll echo those. I thought that last chapter by Z really very pushed my thinking, but also in a very practical way. And I just found that really useful. And I love, as you were mentioning, chapter 1 using this man box activity, which just many people are familiar as participants or maybe as facilitated, and saying it can be pretty simple. And for some audiences, that might be great, right? Just to get them in and, that's where they're at. But then here's what can be missing and here's how you could add that. And then here's what also could be missing and here's how you can add that. So we don't have to do a one size fits all. Because if you're working with high school students, that intro spot might be just spot on. But how do you bring in other intersecting forms of oppression? How do you not reinforce those gender norms? And I love how they sort of took this and didn't say it's good or bad, but here's how it could be, here's how it could be done better, here's how it could be done in a different way, here's how you can meet different audience needs. And Kyle and Rachel's talking about dialogue, and I love the framework of thinking about different programs in different ways. Brian, what would you add?
Keith, yeah, I'll add another one. I think when we think about assessment and evaluation, so I'll go to chapter 5. I'm thinking about Lucas, Brian's, and Jamie's chapter. They offer an outcome-based assessment framework that can really be applied to that focus on men and masculinities and programs. And I think for me in particular, it's more than just I facilitate a program, I assessed it, it's done, right? They offer this comprehensive framework. So they use an example called taking off the mask, and they describe that, and through 6 different phases, they offer a recurring model. And so I really appreciate it, just from identifying different goals, how to report findings, and how to refine and change. And I think for me, when you think about the work, how to assess and evaluation is something that you should think about throughout the process and not just at one point. And so pushing us to think about what does assessment and evaluation look like within the context of Men and Masculinities programming. So chapter 5 is another one that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, I often joke when I talk about that chapter that it's the sexiest assessment chapter that I've ever read in my life, and I really mean that, because I think that the 3 of those folks have done such a lovely job of sort of talking about assessment in a very practical, real way that makes it feel like, okay, I can do this. And I think sometimes assessment is that area for a lot of practitioners. Like, I don't know what I should be doing. I'm not sure how to capture that. And I think those 3 just wrote something that I think is just so helpful. Yeah, it's really great.
Yeah, and I think I echo that. I see a lot of folks avoid assessment because they value it, but they're overwhelmed with how to do that. And that chapter really helps make things, simplify things, and a lot of useful things for folks who want to explore leadership programs or things unrelated to gender or masculinities. Well, before we get you down, so you're naming all of the chapters, let's zoom back out. We talked about how this project got started, a little bit about what the 2 of you have done. We're sharing out the chapter and where folks can get the books and some great takeaways. I'm curious if there's, as we mentioned, this is building on past scholarship in this field and in other fields. And one of the really exciting things is, you've been working on this for 2 years, right? Ish, yeah. Ish. Maybe feels like longer, maybe shorter. But now that it's been a while since the chapters have been done and you've reviewed them, and it's been in the process of being moved to publication. What's kind of the forward-leaning edge for the two of you? As editors, you got to interact with all these different scholars and practitioners doing all this, coming in. But since you've kind of put the cap on the book, are there new things that you're starting to think about, or kind of on the immediate horizon for you? And then I'll throw the second question. You can build it in however you want. What do you hope that first-year doc student who reads this and is just so energized by this, what do you hope they'll pursue in scholarly interests? Or perhaps new faculty who are looking for a research agenda, read this and think, this is for me, I really want to do this. What are some of the things beyond the immediate horizon?
Yeah, I'll start, Dan. I think for me, it's more practice-based scholarship. I mean, to me, this text really is an initial way to push us to think about these topics, but we need more, right? So I would say start there. We need to think about this work in interdisciplinary ways. I can't stress that enough. I think for me, we have to think outside of higher ed. I'll build on Z's point there. We need to really think about it in intersectional ways, right? How does race play a role in this? How does sexual orientation, how does ability, how does spirituality, how do these other social identities intersect? But also thinking about just larger issues of power and privilege as it relates to the work as well. And so just complicating it. We wanted to do that within this text, but we need to do more of that. I think about methodological reimagining, right? I think about designing empirical studies, more than just sitting down with a group of people and talking to them. Like, what are some possibilities? I know in my own work, I do a lot with photos and using photographs to explain some of these realities. But what are some ethnographic ways? What are, through videos? I think from a methodological standpoint, I think it would be really awesome if we could really lean in and design studies in ways to really get at some of these realities, but to reimagine things. So I would say practice-based, interdisciplinarity, intersectional, and methodological reimagining would be 4 things that I would push folks to think about who are doing the work.
I think those are great suggestions for this work, but that's great suggestions for all work in higher ed, right? To
Absolutely.
be more practical, relevant, and focused,
Absolutely.
interdisciplinary, intersectional, and reimagining methodological approaches. I think that's great, regardless of what we're looking at in the topic. So great suggestions. Yeah. How about you, Dan? What has got your brain tickling about since you've put a wraps on this project, and I'm sure you keep thinking about it?
Yeah, I do. So Keith, earlier you mentioned something that actually is exactly in line with what one of the areas that I think is important, and that is how oftentimes these programs get created on college campuses and they're not sustainable because the personnel leave. The personnel who has the passion for Men and Masculinities work suddenly, as a new professional, comes in, builds a program, and then leaves, and then there's no one there to sort of take on that generative sort of coordination of it beyond. And so I think
undergraduate student who has championed it graduates.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. It's a graduation cycle, right? And so I do think that, focusing in a little bit on that and sort of understanding sort of capacity for change on a campus in terms of this work and how much investment is there is an area that I think would be interesting and important to sort of talk about, and particularly sort of understanding what that does for a particular community. I think I would just echo what Brian says. For me, I love the great examples of like, this institution is doing this program. And I would love to sort of think about, okay, what would a new book look like that was sort of grounded in longitudinal studies of these programs and their effects. I'm starting this fall to have the great pleasure of working with a Men of Color initiative through a Hispanic Serving Institution grant that my institution has, along with a community college that's right next door to us. And so thinking strategically about that class and working with my colleagues to set up the syllabus, I'm drawing on a lot of what I'm learning from my the contributing authors to think about this comprehensive program in an academic setting and how that has connections to the co-curricular experience and these students' retention and persistence in higher ed. And so, again, I just think there is great scholarship that's really focused broadly on sort of men and the retention issues that especially men of color are often experiencing in higher education institutions. But then what are we doing for sort of examining those programs that are designed and implemented to sort of address that? And so more of that research, more of that community-based research could be really, really helpful. Again, I would also say thinking about different institutional types, right? So what does this programming look like at a community college? What does this look like at an HSI or at a HBCU? Or what does it look like in just different sites? And trying to grapple with that. That research, I think, is incredibly necessary and important. And again, I think, too, just to sort of loop back to what I started with, is also more research that interrogates and problematizes masculinities as a whole. And again, I think just reinforcing the notion that men do not own masculinities. And so how can we really be thoughtful about what that means for gender socialization? How do women impact the socialization of masculinities and gender to other men? How does that, again, there's great emergent research on trans and transmasculine, or trans men and transmasculine men. And so how, like, furthering that agenda and what that looks like will be important to us as we continue to also understand that our student population is dynamically evolving and changing, and how are we best sort of including all men and masculine individuals coming into our programs and serving them. So again, these are some of the things that I just think more continued research will help us better serve these men and hopefully get them to graduation and have better life-affirming choices in their life.
Well, that's easy, right? Get them to graduation, more life-affirming choices, right? Right? A wonderful call. So much room in there for other scholars and thinkers and research projects to add theirs. What is if you, as the two of you are building on Sharon Harper and Tracy Davis and Jason Laker and Frank Harris and other folks and people who came before them, Kimmel and Kaufman and Connell and some of those folks. Where do you hope folks will build on this and really move things forward? What do you hope this kind of contributes off and builds on? If you had doc students asking, what should I be researching? What should I be looking at? Are there particular things that you'd encourage?
It's a great question.
It is a great question. I mean, I will go back. So for me, I'm going to go back to the methodological reimagining. I think, we have a tendency to, again, and particularly thinking about qualitative work, it's more than just sitting down one time and hearing people's stories. And I just want to push against that, but also meeting students where they are, right? Like, so I think about the role of social media a lot and how men are interacting on social media and some of those messages and just kind of teasing that out a bit more. I think, again, meeting students where they are. I think about methodology. And again, like I said earlier, just more practice-based work. I mean, again, I don't want to keep hitting that, but I think for me, if I were a new doc student and how do I jump into this literature base? One, I would say read the book, right? Because again, just thinking about how theory has evolved. One thing I didn't say earlier that I want to say now, we were also inspired by D.L. Stewart and Susan Jones's chapter around the evolution of student development theory. I think it was chapter 2 in the New Directions book in 2016, but thinking about the evolution of theory through 3 waves. And we actually took each of those waves and talked about how Men and Masculinities work has evolved through those 3 waves that really sets context for the text. And so I encourage folks to look at that. I believe that's in chapter 2. But I think in reading that chapter in particular, that could actually help you pose new questions about where to go with the work. If we're trying to think about reimagine this third wave, right, and where the work is going. Some of the things that Dan talked about. Who's excluded? Like who's not? When we talk about men and masculinities, who are we not talking about? I think a lot of times this work excludes, and we want to push against that. And so I just think scholars who are wanting to come to the work understand where the work is. I think a lot of times when we design, we must understand where we've been and where we are and where we're going. And so it's really doing that work to understand how the discipline has evolved is what I would push folks. We like to just go and design without really understanding how we got to where we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great setup, because the Alyssa Abis, Susan Jones, and D.L. Stewart's new book, Rethinking College Student Development Theory Using Critical Frameworks, which builds on that chapter that you had mentioned, Brian, is coming out shortly and will be my next Student Affairs Live episode in September. We're looking at September 25th. So for folks who find that interesting, we're gonna dive into more of that. We'll get details out about that as we get them finalized. But I think it is an interesting way to organize student development theory and push our thinking into new realms, bringing in scholarship beyond student affairs and higher education to inform that and nudge that. Yeah. How about you, Dan? Any suggestions for emerging scholars out of there really wanting to make a contribution and build on what's already here?
Yeah, I do. I think there are a couple of different areas that I would encourage. Like if I was to sit down with a doc student who was interested in this, one that I keep going back to, I think there's some fantastic work around critical whiteness studies that's coming out. And certainly I think about Nolan Cabrera's new book and other folks who are doing some preliminary work who I'm connected to on social media, who are writing comps or sort of strategizing about their dissertations. But I think connected, how does whiteness and masculinity, particularly hegemonic masculinity, really coalesce in ways that are potentially very dangerous and unhealthy and problematic? And so having a little bit more of the connection between whiteness and masculinity and the relationship there and how that then plays out, I think is incredibly needed. I also would say then, how does that sort of transform or trickle down to sort of thinking about the ways in which anti-Black racism and other forms of sort of byproducts of oppression are playing out? And that could be transphobia, sexism, really trying to interrogate some of the power structures here, and be thoughtful about what that means for the student experience. Again, I keep thinking back to the fact that so many of these programs around men and masculinities work are really developed to help support that retention initiative to get college men through the pipeline to graduation, and that there is this continued issue of attrition, particularly in racialized, underrepresented communities. And so I just think that more attention really needs to be paid to that, and particularly to understand whether the programs that we have designed are actually empirically doing their work in terms of the job. Sometimes if they're grant funded, then certainly there have to be outcomes that are reported. But oftentimes I think that many of the programs are maybe relying too heavily on anecdotal data rather than actually doing some empirical research on it. And so how could we actually use that to sort of benefit? Additionally, I would just encourage folks to continue to reframe the ways in which they come to this work and to think about the research, not necessarily from a deficit lens or that there's a problem, but how could we actually use appreciative inquiry and sort of more positive approaches to sort of then how are folks who are doing this work well or engaging in healthy masculinities, and how could we maybe learn from them and replicate out? This is not a new idea. Certainly, Sean and Frank have talked a lot about this, but I think it's something that's really important to echo, because again, I think sometimes we do sort of have the loaded sort of the crisis of college men, and I think we have to continue to aggregate that. We need to problematize that. and think a little bit more critically about what that really means and who's carrying that message. Because again, I think that message is really loaded in some white supremacist ideology. And I think that's rather dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a lot of suggestions for how we move forward. And as we started talking about the overlap of toxic masculinity and hegemonic masculinity and cultural masculinities, and then shifting to this notion of healthy masculinities, one of the worries I have is if we collectively, if the three of us decided what healthy masculinity is, that wouldn't fit for everybody, right? It wouldn't fit for different men, and how a healthy masculinity is for the three of us could look very differently. So we don't just need to replace that with another mask or another box that we need to fit into. But as we talk about expansive practice, how do we help everybody live out their gender the way that they feel really is authentic and fits for them without those external shoulds, which brings us back to self-authorship and another very scholarly connection here. Well, we're coming up here on our time. I would love just to hear a final takeaway or a few final takeaways from each of you, or things that you were hoping to mention that you just didn't get a chance to, or maybe even other resources you want to connect people to.
Yeah, I would say for me, engaging in this work and this project was very rewarding. Again, this is a to-do book, right? Designed for someone who I want to learn more about the work. I want to understand where the work is going, and I want to really understand how to. And we've given folks a roadmap to do that. I also want to just talk, being vulnerable for a moment. Like during this project, I lost both of my parents during this project. And I think for me, I dedicated this book to my parents. And I just want to just go on record here and just thank Dan for his leadership throughout the project. But also it was very tough pushing through, and I was inspired by the chapters that were coming in and being able to do that. And so for me, this book has a special meaning for me as well. I want to thank each of the 24 authors that contributed to the text, the stylist team, and I'm very proud of the work. And so just thank everyone who played a role in it as well. So those are my final thoughts.
Yeah, that resonates with me, Brian. As I was doing my dissertation research on this topic, it was the personal that motivated me to keep going. It was how will this help me connect with my father? How will this help me connect with my friends? How will this help me connect with people with different genders? How will this help me better understand me and myself and how I move through the world? And so those personal connections and reminders really bring resonance and meaning to the work when we make those connections. So I really appreciate you bringing that in. I think a lot of times we get messages, we need to separate that stuff out. I think that's a huge mistake. Bring it in, bring it in.
Absolutely. I think to echo and go off of that, I think the conversations that Brian and I were able to have in the struggle of all of the personal stuff that was happening, to me, it reinforced, again, how men can sort of reach out and ask for help and to engage in what we're hoping from this book, right? To actually say, I need help. I need support. I can't do this right now. I need some time. I think there was sort of an interesting sort of piece even within our relationship. I love Brian as a friend, but that only increased over the time of working on this project, partly because of the circumstances that both of us were experiencing in different ways. And certainly the loss of his family members was significant. And so, to me, I just think there's something in that that's been really important personally, but also professionally. I think let
me just interject real quick before you make some other suggestions. I think that's beautiful, and it transgresses what men are socialized into doing, which is don't ask for help, don't say where you need, don't ask for support, don't do that. So it's a great way of modeling a different way of showing up and radical pro-feminist approaches. So
absolutely, for sure. For sure. And I think, to me, I've been using the language a lot about this book as it was a labor of love. And I really do feel that way. I think, to me, this is a love letter to folks who are out there really wanting to make some change, to support young men, men who are full-on grown adults, the whole gamut, even young boys. I do think that, while this is very much set up to think about college men, there's a lot of application that could be taken and adapted to middle school and high school young boys and their development. And I think that's another area that I would just say too, for future research, how do we sort of implement this in a K through 12 setting, and how could that have very positive, beneficial outcomes for the pipeline as a whole. But I think, to me, I do see this as a labor of love. It's been a wonderful opportunity to hopefully put some ideas out to the world that can make some very positive change for men and their experiences in higher education, but also just beyond the college experience. How could we help equip men to be better fathers, to be better spouses, to be better significant others, to really engage in work to sort of stand up for others and engage in feminist sort of gender equity work. And that's at home, at work, everywhere in their community. And so I just think that that's really powerful. And I hope that if that's what happens of this, then I can sleep really soundly at night and feel really proud of the work that all of our chapter authors and my co-editor were able to sort of do. So really excited and really also want to hear from folks about how they're using the book. Yeah, so I would just say, if you're reading it and you find it useful, let us know. If you're reading it and you hate it, great, let us know. I think I really am interested genuinely in terms of what people, how people are using it, what they think needs to be addressed next. What are some additional pieces? Because I think that's an important conversation for us to continue to have.
Yeah, what a great reminder. I think I love that you're inviting feedback, and for those folks out there reading this book or other books in higher education and feeling like these authors are unreachable, they're very easy to reach. They're on Twitter, they're on social media, their email's in there. Reach out to them. I think when you write a book like this, it's a 2-year labor of love and so much time and energy. And then when people want to talk with you about what they liked or what they didn't like, that's so rewarding, right? And if you've got critiques of it even, it can be so rewarding. So I would encourage people who want to do that to reach out and engage in that. I want to thank you both. I think you both can sleep well. You've done a great job. It's a great book. You've invited wonderful people who contributed lots of things in lots of different ways. It brings new, innovative thinking, builds on what was already there, and very practical in lots of ways. So one of the things we need to do is we need to tell people where they can get this. So you can get this through Stylus directly. If you use the discount code MASC20, MASC20 on Stylus' website, you can get a 20% off your copy. So if folks are intrigued, really want to get to it, that's the best way to do that. We'll also tweet that out. You can also access it on Amazon and many other places. But for folks looking to get this for themselves, for other colleagues to use in coursework, for professional development reading, or to support folks on their campus doing this work, you can get it through Stylus or Amazon. Again, there's that code MASC20 on Stylus' website for a discount. So I really appreciate the two of you sharing that discount with our viewers and participants who are here today and listening on the podcast and the video otherwise. So thanks to you both. I'm grateful to you both for your time as panelists today, also to the great work of our producers behind the scenes. Folks can receive reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to the HigherEdLive newsletter or browse our archives at HigherEdLive.com. Again, I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Thanks to our fabulous guests who are watching. Thanks for all that you've done and your good work and the contribution you made. And have a great week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.